Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Laura from PleiadianHealer.com, and today I want to talk about world origins and how different timelines play into it. So first, a forewarning, this might get super confusing and super meshed up because it's literally that. There's so many different stories that go into it and so many people who have written and rewritten those stories. But maybe we'll get an overview. We'll see. We'll dig through it. So I'm going to share a screen and I'm going to share some family trees as well. So timelines, bloodlines, family trees, world origins is the overall topic. We're going to go into biblical timelines, Greek timelines, meaning Old Greek, God, goddesses timelines, possibly Atlantis, how it ties into that, but more so ancient Egypt, starting with Osiris, the entire Osiris story too. Okay, so this is another one, Adam and Eve. There were at least two different bloodlines and lineages due to Lilith being around too, and I think that's where things get completely confusing, especially if you look at the biblical timelines. This is just a quick overview, by the way. We'll go into this. So we have Adam and Eve, and then the descendants of them, but some of them actually aren't the descendants of Eve. Some of them are the descendants of Lilith. And then obviously that ties into King David, Solomon, and then there's a timeline shift in between, and then we have Yeshua and other types of stories. So okay, let's go into this. Where do we even start? So I got some insight. I think we might mention that more towards the end. Okay, let's start with the biblical one. First and foremost, you have the story of Adam and Eve, right? Which everyone's kind of familiar with that. And so what it kind of felt like to me, we had different resets. Like I already mentioned in one video where I was talking about, are we on the sixth reset, or what type of reset are we on? It felt like Adam and Eve was around the fourth reset, meaning there were a few resets before that, but also a few after that. And around 800 BC, which was, well, if we can believe the timeline, was around 2,800 years ago, there was for sure another timeline shift. Not sure if it had to do with another mud flood or something similar to that. And then obviously we had another timeline shift in the 1800s. Was there another one in between? Possibly. You know, is this like a timeline reset in a way? I guess it is, because it's resetting everything. So if we start with Adam and Eve, how many years ago was this? And so this is just, you know, going according to chronological order. If we can kind of just dig through, I know we can't believe anything really that's out there, right? That the Bible puts out there, that other scriptures put out there. But we have this timeline of creation, which some say was around 4004 BC, but then other documents say it was closer to like 9800 BC. So that's already a huge, massive 5,000 year difference. So we have the event creation, the flood, which was 2348 BC, the Tower of Babel, which was around 2246 BC, Abraham supposedly closer to 2000 BC. We had Joseph. Joseph is Joseph from Egypt, which we'll go into that, around 1700 BC. Moses and the Exodus, and that's when they were going through the desert for 40 plus years. You can feel that very strongly in Jordan, by the way. 1490 BC, like 1500 BC. We had David, which was around 1000 BC. The monarchy divides around 975 BC. Assyrian destruction of Israel, 722 BC. So that was right after the timeline shift, by the way. And then Babylonian captivity of Judah, 586 BC. And then Jesus/Jeshua, 4 BC. So around the year 0. Okay, so this is, if you go to the Bible timeline, this is what they're giving us. And so to start with Adam and Eve, what's completely forgotten, obviously, is that there was Lilith. And some people know about Lilith, right? And so we just kind of go into this tree. So I kind of found this family tree right here, which it says Adam twice. I think that's a typo. So it's like Adam and Eve. They had Abel, they had Cain and Seth, and supposedly other sons and daughters. So this is, once again, we're just theoretically going through this, and I'm just sharing insight closer to the end on this too. But supposedly Abel got extinguished, just kind of terminated because he was killed by Cain. And then Cain had this lineage right here. You can see that where my mouse is pointing. So you see a lot of names are repetitive. You have a lot of, if you go to Enoch, you have Enoch related to Cain. But then if you go to Seth and all the other siblings, we have another Enoch here. And so I think what we're having is another case of people being named similar names and the names getting mixed up. And this is also the case with all the Marys in the Bible. There were a million Marys around Jesus times, meaning Joshua times. And so some people think Mary Magdalene was the Virgin Mary, which isn't true. That was like the mother of Jesus, and something Mary Magdalene was like the prostitute, and others thinks there was another Mary, and all these Marys. So it's like the stories of all these Marys is getting mixed up, and I think similar is happening to the Enoch stories and people who are just called similar. So we have Seth right here, which I completely forgot about Seth. But what's interesting is if you go to Isis, Osiris, you also have Seth. And then there's another sister. And so that's the ancient Egypt story. I'm not saying these two Seths are the exact same Seths, but the name is similar. So that's interesting, in my opinion. Okay, so you have all these descendants. And so we go down from Seth down. So Seth was born after Cain and Abel, according to legend, according to the biblical scriptures, because he was gifted to them after that. That's just what they're saying. So then you have Noah down here. Okay, so that's one family lineage, and that's how it's kind of all starting. So if we really go back to the beginning, Adam and Eve, everyone is supposed to be descendant from them. Here's another simplified one. We have Noah, and Noah was the great flood, and the great flood, in a form or another, as already had in a different video earlier this year, was a form of not reset, but kind of like another, similar to the 1800s mud floods, if that makes sense. So then we have a timeline of biblical events. So they're saying 4000 BC, but somewhere else I read closer to like 10,000 BC, so 9800 BC or something. So Adam and Eve, once again, Lilith is completely forgotten here. Lilith came before Eve. You have the Tower of Babel. Noah is not even, Noah is mentioned down here. I was like, Noah is not even mentioned. So you have Noah, which was 2400 BC, Abraham, which was 200-300 years after that. So supposedly Abraham is supposed to be descendant from Noah, but as we'll find out later, that's not necessarily the case. Then you have Jacob right here. Jacob is Joseph's father, and Joseph is the one, when they moved to Egypt to escape, just the hunger in Israel and other things. Basically, they were in Egypt for 430 years. And then there was the Exodus from Egypt, and that was set in motion by Moses. So Joseph was also sold to Egypt by his brothers. And this is kind of important because back then they're saying Adam lived 900 years, supposedly, from the Adam and Eve. And that Abraham also turned like 800 something years. And Abraham had a wife called Sarah, or Sarai. So her name was Sarai with an I at the end, and then they kind of turned it into an H after she gave birth to her child. But basically, they turned very old. And so all these timelines are already a bit mixed up because we have people who are turning like 1,000 years old. And so I think for sure it wasn't 4000 BC, but it was way before that. So then we have Moses right here around 1446, and then they led, there's the 10 Commandments, all of that. They kind of led the entire Israelites through the desert, through Jordan, through all of that land that's around there for around 40 years. They led them through there, kind of got lost in the desert. And so Moses ends up dying. And then you have Joshua, who then leads the next generation of Israelites into Canaan or Canaan. And Canaan comes, when I first looked up the word Canaan, it has Irish origins. So I actually knew someone whose last name was Canaan. I'm like, oh, I wonder where Canaan comes from. And this is years ago, before all of this. And it actually has an Irish origin. So the names are even repeating themselves. So Canaan is a form of country or land. And it's tied to Israel, but it's also, you find it in Israel. You find it in Ireland over and over again too. So fast forward, you have Ruth, the story of Ruth. You have Saul. Saul was a king. Then you have David around 10,000 BC. You have Solomon right after that, David's son. And Solomon is that person who, it's going to get important for the next video, where we're going to go through the Freemason meaning of the Lionsgate portal and the lions in general. That would be Solomon. So it has to do with the tribe of Judah and everything too. Okay, so then we have Jonah. Jonah is the one, if I'm not mistaken, Jonah is Jonah and the whale, which is around 760 BC. So right here in between, you see this huge split, right? Between 971 and 760, there's this huge thing. There's almost like 200 years missing. That was when something happened. That was like a huge timeline split. And I'll explain that a few moments down the line too. And you can find that in every single culture, not even the biblical scriptures, but in every single culture. You can find that when you go through Italian culture too. And that's actually when Rome came about right after that. So before Rome, you obviously had people living in Italy, but they called themselves different. They had a different alphabet, a different everything. So 604, Babylon conquers Judah. Jews exiled, Babylonian exile 70. I think this has to do with destruction of temple, and then also Tisha B'Av and the 3 sad weeks, all of that. Okay, so we go here. Esther is in between as well. Oh, we have Alexander. So Alexander is Greek, 323, Alexander the Great. I think Troy was somewhere around 1400 BC, closer to Moses, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe right after that. Troy is where they were at war for 11 plus years. Okay, so then you have Alexander and then Jesus and all of that, and it kind of ends right there, right? So that's, in short, that's the timeline that we're given. And so it kind of started because I was looking up, okay, well, how are all these people related? How is Jonah related to Abraham, to this, and this? And so you're talking about different tribes and different origins, and this would be a good pointer. Okay, so the main problem here is that Lilith is completely forgotten in the entire equation. So you have at least 2 different bloodlines and lineages that you're talking about. And Noah and Abraham, in that sense, aren't even necessarily related, because one stems from Lilith and the other one stems from Eve. And so the confusion continues. So Adam and Eve, it starts with Adam and Eve, at least in the 4th reset. Cain, Abel, Seth. After that, you have a few more descendants, and then Noah. Then you have Abraham and Sarah, or Sarai. Then you have Jacob. Jacob is the father of Joseph of Egypt. Joseph of Egypt was a slave in Egypt, for people who've forgotten that part, including myself. I actually had to look this up because I completely forgot about all of this. Then you had Moses and Joshua right after that. You had King David, and Solomon was the son of King David. People are saying Joshua comes from King David. I don't think necessarily it's that simple. Solomon is the Judah tribe. It ties into the entire Lions and Freemasonry. So I'm just gonna write my notes on this, and in between you have all these Greek gods as well, which from my understanding, what I always thought is, and then you have ancient Egypt, that these Greek gods came way before Adam and Eve, but not necessarily. So you had King Tutankhamun, who was closer to ancient Egypt, or whatever you would consider ancient Egypt, and they're saying that was around the year 1400 BC. You had Moses. Around Moses, you had Ramses II. So if you just kind of tie ancient Egypt and the biblical all into one, you know, like the Jewish history and the Egyptian history, it all interacts with each other. You had the tribe of Ephraim, or Ephraim. Then you had Joseph. and the house of Joseph. So it was all around the same time. It was like 1321 BC to 2000 BC, approximately then. And what I also found was the roles are interchanged between being Jewish and ancient Egyptian. So, for example, if you have King Tutankhamun, who died at the age of 19 or 18, and he was basically only ruling for 9 years. So that's the one who was the youngest pharaoh of all times, or is someone who was like the, why again was he so impressive? I forgot why he was always worshipped, but it had to do with him being pretty young and only having ruled for 9 years straight. And so Tutankhamun could have been, you know, if you want to talk about reincarnating over and over again, he could have been reincarnated after into more like the Jewish tribe, but kind of sticking to the same land. And so, because you had Jewish people in Egypt for 400 plus years, that would kind of fit. The Jewish were not allowed to dine at the same table as Egyptians back in those days. Joshua led the Moses tribe to the land of Canaan. Canaan is also Irish. King Tut, so King Tutankhamun, had a chariot accident. So there's a symbol of the chariot. The chariot is this carriage that is usually 2 horses are in front of that, but not, it depends. In the Egyptian version, it might not even be pulled by horses. It might be pulled by humans. So King Tutankhamun stands for the chariot. The chariot is also typically a sign for Cancer, the zodiac sign. Can powerful souls accomplish a lot in a short time frame? Because he accomplished a lot in 9 years. He accomplished so much that he actually, everyone wants to see his tomb, you know, like his tomb was like the most sought after item for the longest of time. So you have to ask yourself, why was King Tut exactly so important when he was only in power for 9 years? You have Moab in the Bible. Moab is an area which is in Jordan, and it actually looks similar to Utah. So you also have a Moab in Utah. Are they trying to rebuild biblical sites here in the US? So someone commented a little while ago saying, or I guess it's a lot of people think that when they follow these other truther channels that the original Egypt was here in the US, closer to the Grand Canyon, all of that. But I'm getting more no, the original Egypt was definitely where Egypt and Sudan and all of that is. However, there's a form of trying to rebuild biblical sites and renaming them in similar ways too. And so if you look at the entire landscape of Jordan and you go to Arizona and Utah, which I've been to both of those places, I can confirm that it looks very similar. And there are several different areas all over the world that they keep looking similar over and over again. Namibia supposedly looks similar to Antelope Canyon and that area too. So it's definitely interesting how that's done. You had the Kingdom of Israel, which was Ammon, Judah, Edom, etc. So it had several different sub-lands below it. You have Upper, Lower Egypt, and Sudan. So where King Tutankhamun was more active was actually what's now Lower Egypt on the border of Sudan. Joseph was the son of Jacob and Rachel, and Jacob was later given the name of Israel, which I kept wanting to put that to Israel, so kind of leaving out the E. Maybe the E was added for confusion later. You know, when you say Israel, like EL is from the archons and all of that. Maybe they didn't add that until later. There were 12 tribes of Israel formed in Egypt. So they were in Egypt for hundreds of years. Egypt had just the entire slavery thing going on. So maybe that's also the energy of the land. You know, when you have slaves there, it kind of transfers over and over again into every single civilization that comes after that. So around 1200 BC is when this entire story of, because the house of Joseph and the Joseph, who was the son of Jacob, he was basically a slave because he was sold off by his brothers to the Egyptians. He was basically a slave under whoever was the pharaoh at that time. I don't know if it was Ramses or someone else. So you had the Kingdom of Israel, and basically you have a kingdom everywhere else after that too, especially in the medieval ages. Like kingdom just keeps coming up over and over again. And before that, you had Abraham and Sarah. Then you had Dan, D-A-N, which is a city. So all these sites are under war right now too. A lot of these sites are either what's now Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, all those areas where you can barely visit. Okay, so there's a son of a son of a son of a son of Eber, and that they're related to Noah. Noah was 500 years old before the sons were born. Was the flood a reset? I think we got yes on that in that one video that I quoted. There's an so Noah was 8th generation to Adam, which is the first human, and it seems to be 10,000 years ago, or like the 10,000 BC. So timelines of creation are really mixed up. But ancient Egypt actually confirms the Bible in that sense, because the pharaohs did exist to a certain degree. Moab was the promised land. Are we getting things done faster now than during biblical times? I'm literally just reading my notes here, so they're going to be all over the place. The Tower of Babel in Babylon, the heart of Iraq. The house of the foundation of heaven on earth. And then so in between all of that, the timelines are all mixed up. You had the Greek gods in between that too. And so the Greek gods were closer to 900 or 800 BC. That's the first time they were really cited in any type of literature. So you have Cronus up here, who is a giant. They're all giants. Cronus and Rhea. And from all of that came Poseidon, Hera, Zeus, Demeter, and Aphrodite. And then you have all of these down here. So altogether, I think it's 12. 1, 2, 6. It's like 12. I thought it was always 12. Maybe it's more than that. And they have different names in the Roman mythology, but they're basically the same gods. So Zeus, Jupiter, it's the same person. It's the same god, basically. So you had the 12 titans. They were separating heaven from earth. Was this heaven created before the biblical times? Is a question I wrote down. Now, what you also had was that one of these gods, I forgot which one, was castrated somehow. And so if you look at our times nowadays, you have this castration theme running with the most recent conflict that we have in Ukraine. You know, if you listen to the news lately, some Ukrainian soldiers were supposedly castrated, all of that. So you have the castration theme running for the longest of times, you know, since biblical times and on. And it also is mentioned in the Greek mythology. And the castration has to do with having no children. They don't want you to have, you know, any descendants. And what are men supposed to get nowadays too? A vasectomy. Well, doesn't mean they're going to get it, but the media is kind of pushing towards that, right? Because so that women don't have to take birth control and all of that too. It's like the agenda that they want to push. So, what are the real timelines? And then okay, we're going to get to the portals in a second here. What I wrote down was Adam, Noah, Abraham, Joseph, Moses, together with ancient Egypt. So they were kind of with ancient Egypt. Then you had the Greek and Roman gods, and it felt like there was a transfer of energy to that area. So from whatever was Egypt, Israel, more towards the Greece and Rome area, was their destruction of heaven on earth. Because in the Greek mythology, there's a huge emphasis on how heaven and earth, how it's kind of upheld by one of these titans, separating heaven from earth, you know, similar to the Anunnaki saga too, but that's a different one. Also, Greek gods have planet names, or is that more like the Roman mythology where they're called Mars and all of that? You know, I think could be the Roman one. But anyways, these gods have the names of a planet. And so if we just assume the planets are AI or kind of made up, they're just like projection around us. They're projecting the gods around us in that sense. So 800 BC was a period of great change for many nations. And right before that, you had King David. But Rome gains control. So this is more of the ancient Rome, gains control 500 BC and on. Were we thrown on a different timeline from then on? And what if all timelines are wrong and mixed up? Egypt, ancient Egypt supposedly ended with Cleopatra, which was right around, was it 32 BC? It was like 30 years before Jesus, supposedly. It was similar to when Gaius Julius Caesar was murdered by his people. So that was around 30 BC. Okay. There's another thing where, and especially if you go to the house of Joseph, Joseph was a dream interpreter. So he actually kind of got out of slavery or obtained a higher position in slavery, if that's even possible. So he was a slave to the Egyptians, to, I think, a political figure, and then he kind of became a slave to the pharaoh because he was able to interpret dreams, and he interpreted a hunger ahead, kind of like the entire people not being able to be fed, like that was like a 7-year plague or whatever. So there's this lost art of dreams and dream interpretation that's definitely mentioned in biblical scriptures. And then I just want to share my own insight here. So I know things are a bit mixed up, but if you're still following along, maybe something makes sense. Okay, so are the timelines kind of correct that we mentioned? It does appear so. So was Adam the first human? Yes, possibly in the fourth reset. And it kind of seemed like during this fourth reset, so there were resets before that, there were things before that, that wherever we are, call it Earth, call it whatever, Earth gained stability again. And the number 4 kept coming up over and over again. Maybe in the fourth reset, spirituality gained momentum. There was also this like water element that came through, so it's almost like maybe the fourth reset happened through a flood, but it could have very well also been this ice age component. Starting a new Earth, not in a new age term, but more like starting like a new reset or whatever in an up-leveled way. So when people are talking about Adam and Eve were created in a lab, okay, maybe it could have very well been, but it doesn't mean that your soul essence is lab created. Nowadays you have like these soulless beings that don't really have a soul spark in them, or just like that divine spark in them. So it could have been that the bodies are lab created, but not like your divine spark, if that makes sense. Lilith as a first woman, and Eve kind of also as one of the first women. So it does appear that Lilith came before Eve, but they were kind of around the same time. There was a lineage with Lilith, but the only one that's being talked about is the Adam and Eve one. And the entire creation story, and this is where, people who still read the Bible, this is where everything kind of goes wrong. The entire story that's being sold in those scriptures and also other creation scriptures is based on the Adam and Eve lineage, whereas there could have been 2 or more, meaning the lineage of Adam and Lilith, or maybe even another person, but it's just not being mentioned. So maybe there were even like 4 people, meaning 2 couples. So these other lineages are in hiding. So we have the Adam and Lilith lineage, meaning they had descendants, offspring. And then you have the Adam and Eve lineage. Was Adam a clone? No, it doesn't necessarily seem that way. So I think there goes more into this entire cloning story than just saying they were lab created. Did Adam live in the same reality we live now? Meaning, are we in the same realm that he was in? It could have been somehow, but it somehow felt that there was just, see, there's a lot of psychic blocks. When you try to read on these things, you get so much interference. So we didn't get a clear yes or no, but there is a form of an overlap between the realms somehow. So wherever we are, there is an overlap somehow to the realm that he was in. A realm based on emotions, facing this one or facing each other. Does the place Adam and Eve lived and still exist? Seemed like it was more free-spirited back then. So it's kind of like when tapping into Adam's energy, or just like this entire story, their spirits seemed younger, more hopeful. And so it's almost like, when you just start your entire journey of, oh, we just came here, it was just supposed to be a very short gig, only like 2 weeks or whatever, it turned into 2 million years or whatever. you're like more hopeful in the beginning. You know, you're kind of like, okay, we're not caged in, we're not like kept here and all of that. And so it seemed like the spirit that you're dealing with was like more free spirited, at least when he was around for him. Maybe their spirit was younger too. Something with coming from above. Yeah, I don't want to say coming from the stars, but something like that. So kind of coming from the heavens or whatever. Adam is the creation, or recognized as the creation, and walking, and before that it was kind of like walking through the dark, walking through the winter. So I kind of interpreted that as walking through the ice age. Was there anything before that ice age? Maybe, but it all died, so it doesn't really matter. It feels like there's just more to this entire story of things having been around before that. Does the Old Testament come after the New? Yeah, does the Old Testament come after the New Testament? Because some people are kind of promoting that theory. Very clear no. So the entire thing, why it feels that the Old Testament comes after the new one, is because all of these stories are really mixed up. It's very hard to explain, but to me, it just kind of felt that way. Did the Old Testament happen elsewhere? So things did happen elsewhere, which is why it feels like the timing is all off. It's kind of like the sun was hijacked too. Did Noah come from Adam? Yes. So Noah was the Eve lineage. Did Abraham come from Eve? No. So it seems like Abraham came more from Lilith. That's more like a clear yes that I got. It's kind of like the 8th generation down or more. So there's a lot of these bloodlines just muddled up. Did Joseph of Egypt come from Abraham? A lot of distractions trying to read on this, but I got possibly no. Did Joseph come from Noah? Yes. So if Noah came from Eve, Joseph came from the Eve lineage. Did Moses come from Joseph? Joseph is the slave that was in Egypt. Yes. I feel there's just way more to the story than they're telling us. There was like this foulness to all of it. Did King David come from Moses? Yes, somehow he did. Did Jeshua, meaning Jesus, come from Moses? Yes, but possibly not King David. So I wasn't able to get a clear yes in regards to King David. However, when I was reading on Mary Magdalene, who was basically the divine counterpart to Jeshua, and they were kind of like doing all of this together, it seems that Mary Magdalene actually came more from King David than Joshua, which was interesting to me. Was there a reset around 800 BC? Yes, in a form, it seems to be. And it was also caused by an emperor. So just similar to the mud floods that we had in the 1800s, which were caused by a few kings. Someone keeps causing these resets because of conflict and hard work. And it feels like the resets are caused by people. The 1800s one was caused by 2 opposing kings and their lineages, for example. Was ancient Egypt around the same time Noah was? It seems likely. There's a lot of weird overlap between queens, empresses, and pharaohs, and the female version of the pharaohs. Was ancient Egypt on a different timeline? Yes. So Egypt, and that's kind of what I felt when I was in Egypt myself. Like Egypt was kind of somewhere else. There's a deception going on. There's 2 realities playing into one. Maybe something sort of ended around the Joseph of Egypt story, and then something else came about, and that was the entire what ended with Cleopatra that came about. Was ancient Egypt around Adam and Eve? Kind of. So was it before Noah? It's hard to get an answer on that. So was Cleopatra part of ancient Egypt? Not necessarily. Were the Greek gods after 800 BC? It seems like it, but there's also more to that story. Was Atlantis before Adam? Not necessarily, but maybe. It seems like ancient Atlantis was a bit somewhere else too. Was ancient Rome after ancient Egypt? Yes. It does appear that way somehow. Jeshua was 2,000 years ago, and it kind of brought there's this form of stability that came through. It seems timelines are a bit mixed up over there too, and it's hard to see the origin of the truth. Are certain areas portals like Jerusalem and Petra? Yes, it does appear that way. Let's just go back to this slide here. So if you go to especially Petra and also Jerusalem, it just really feels like you can have access to all these other timelines through it. Were the Ashkenazi Jews, are the Ashkenazi Jews the real Jews? It seems like they're not. It's just like a lot of distraction with that story too. So there's this thing saying the Ashkenazi Jews came around 400 after Christ, 400 AD, or around that time. And whoever the Jews were around Jeshua's times actually looked more like Arabic people, whereas the Ashkenazi Jews are more like the lighter skinned ones and the ones that look more like the Syrians possibly. And obviously Jeshua also spoke Aramaic. So there's just, yeah, so much that goes into that in and of itself, but that they're not necessarily the same Jews. So the Jewish people that you see today, they're obviously even more different, because you see like blonde and blue-eyed and red-headed Jews, and that's just like the entire European lineage that's getting mixed up. But that the Ashkenazi Jews that came 400 years after Jeshua, that those are actually not the exact same Jews that you had. And so the entire story of, you know, Judaism and Jewish, it kind of plays into it, because I always felt Jeshua probably looked more like an Arabic person, or had more that Arabic archonic connection, meaning connection to Archon too. Is that in a good or a bad way? I just kind of felt that very strongly when I was in that area. So we keep getting two bloodlines mixed up that we're dealing with, and that's why everything's mixed up. Oh, this is a good one. Is the Persian calendar the most accurate one? So the Persian calendar that I'm specifically talking about is the Iranian solar Hijri calendar. And it's supposed to be one of the most accurate calendars in the world. It's a solar calendar. What year are we in right now? So actually right now we're in the year 1400. That's interesting. January 1st, 2023 fell into the year 1401. Maybe that's why some people think we're in the year 1400. I was talking to one of my friends when I was in Egypt, and she thought we were in 1400. Okay. So is Babylon or Iraq the cradle of humanity? There are different areas that are kind of all of that. Is the Middle East the cradle of humanity? It used to be, but then everything kind of went elsewhere. So I feel the entire energy transferred over more towards UK and Ireland. And I don't know where it is now, if it's more closer to the US somehow. So we have these two different bloodlines, meaning also timelines, and they're intermeshing somehow. And that's also where all the confusion comes in. And we're being dragged in and out of two different worlds because of it. So Lilith and Eve. And I got the symbology of the sun and the moon timeline, so that the sun is in a different reality than the moon reality. Some people might be more drawn to the sun. Some people might be more drawn to the moon because of it. Are both artificially created? I mean, the moon for sure is, and we have several different suns. We don't only have one sun. Sun is S-U-N, not S-O-N. Just had to emphasize that. So people also get lost in their ego, and it causes a lot of karmic trenches and karmic things, karmic wars, really mixing it. So the wars are really mixing up your energy and distracting you. You know, whenever you have your heart broken because someone dies or all of that. So it's really important to heal yourself as well. And so that kind of ties more into the question of, can you create your own key to get out of this reality, which I think I want to cover in a different video. But okay, I hope this video made sense. I don't know. It's so confusing. Like my entire head was hurting when I was trying to get through all these notes and putting them together. And I was like, you know what? It's going to be almost impossible. So I'm just going to write what I have down, and we'll see how that goes. All right, guys, thank you so much for listening. Let me know what you think. There's also Jericho in between and the entire destruction of that. So there are a lot of things that don't really make a whole lot of sense. And I think if you go to the biblical timeline, the issue with that is the Bible was written by so many different people that it's basically like putting together a whole bunch of fairy tales that don't fit together, that were written by different authors, and trying to make sense of it when it really cannot make sense at all. But some scriptures do give some insight on some things. It's all been misinterpreted by Christians or people who call themselves Christians and people who believe in God and all of that too. And like I already said in a different video, whenever they mention God or Lord in the Bible, they're just talking about a God and a Lord. Like, oh, and God split the sea in half. It's like, oh, a God split the sea in half, meaning one of these titans, one of these giants, or just one of these, someone you can't necessarily see. It's like the technology they have. All right. Thanks for tuning in and have a wonderful one. Bye.